I'm a proud backer of the Paragons of Earth comic book project, now available to support on Kickstarter. The creative team of Percival Constantine, Thomas DJ, and Eric Johns have plucked forgotten Golden Age superheroes from the public domain, reinvented them as their own sort of Justice League, and put them up against a Lovecraftian apocalypse. Back this project and learn more by going to percivalconstantine.com/paragons. Also, Perry, a multiple-time guest on Digging for Kryptonite, hosts the Superhero Cinephiles podcast about comic book-inspired films. Be sure to listen wherever you get podcasts. This episode made possible in part by educator, hobby comic book collector, and pop culture enthusiast Sam Lim. Sam is based in the South Jersey area and is looking to connect with other comics fans as well as retailers. They're also looking for comic shops to explore, so recommendations are welcome. Be sure to follow Sam on Instagram at SZLComics to see their latest comic pickups and shop adventures. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me in studio to discuss Superman and Batman's first meetings across time and media is returning guest Rich Roney. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. And as always, I get so energized out of this stuff. Thank you.
No, I'm happy to have you here. This is exciting. This is an episode that you've been pitching for a while, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes. And the number of stories, there were more stories we had to read than I had originally contemplated. And I enjoyed reading all of them.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. And I will say at the outset that my intention with this episode is to be thorough, but I won't go so far as to say this is comprehensive. There might be some other first meeting out there that we didn't touch on, but I think in terms of in continuity meetings between Superman and Batman, now they might not be in continuity any longer, but they were when they were first published. I think on that front, we've hit just about everything. We purposely left off all of the Elseworlds business because that's its own episode, and maybe we'll do that at some point. But we did try to be as thorough as possible, and we found numerous articles and forum posts and whatnot. And on that note, I just have to share this funny little anecdote about our email exchange, because you sent me an email a while back with this beautiful list of all of these first meetings broken down by era and the notes. You have these notes next to every issue about what happened, what was significant about it. And I'm like, man, he really did a lot of work. I said, he put so much effort and thought and care into this. I said, I have to do my part. Let me see what I can find.
And so, guess what?
And then I searched Superman and Batman first meetings, and like the first search result is this forum post on CBR. Yeah. And I go there and I'm like, oh,
wait a minute.
Same as Rich's list, down to the notes.
Yeah. Wait a minute. These adjectives and these encapsulated descriptions are identical. Rich plagiarized this. I forget when, Anthony, when we first came up with this idea, as soon as I cradled the phone after our talk, I started looking, right? And I found it on the CBR forums, and all I did was copy and paste it into one of my own notes. My hand to God, I couldn't remember where I found it, but I figured I got to get this to him. At least it'll give us a structure and some ideas. So there was no untoward like, oh, look at all the research. No, I totally copied and pasted it from that forum. But thank God it was a comprehensive list. It had a few things on there that we chose not to touch on.
Yeah, because there were a few instances where stories were listed where Superman and Batman first learned each other's identities, or when Superman entrusted Batman with the kryptonite ring, sort of significant moments in the relationship, but not the first meeting. And that's really what we tried to drill down on here. The first time that these characters met in all of these tellings across time and media.
I think the only thing it didn't have was a reference to the radio, the radio adventures. And we're going to talk about that, and I'm looking forward to the entire discussion we've got. You're the pilot, you drive, and
well, let me ask you the big picture question first, and you're the perfect person to have here for this, because as we've talked about on a previous episode, your introduction to comics was an issue of World's Finest, number 143, correct?
You are spot on, yes.
where Superman and Batman go to the bottle city of Kandor. And we talked about that when you were here for our Kandor episode. So I am particularly curious, just generally speaking, given that your entry point into all of this was a Superman-Batman story, for you as a Superman fan, as a Batman fan, just as a DC fan in general, how important is that Superman-Batman relationship to you?
Tremendously important. I mean, again, the very first comic I purchased was that World's Finest Trip to Kandor. But I've always loved these characters separately and when they team up. My heart is with DC on a host of levels, but this is one of the most important relationships and partnerships. I mean, I also love, quite frankly, the Hal Jordan Flash relationship. But this is, I don't know if I'd favor one over the other. I love them both.
As do I. It's funny because we've certainly talked about this relationship at various points over the years, but we've not devoted as much real estate on this podcast as we have to other aspects of the Superman mythology. But I do consider this vitally important for me as a Superman fan and a Batman fan, but also foundational to the DC universe. Just the notion that these two people with such fundamentally different backgrounds, motivations, abilities, methods, are able to come together and forge this trust, this respect, this partnership. And we see it take different forms and have different tones across all of these stories that we look at. But at its core, they are able to come together and work together. And going back to one of the earliest DC events that I read, at least, was Final Night in 96, when the Sun Eater extinguishes the sun and Superman doesn't have his powers. And I always remember this, again, going back to when you're a kid and these early comics just imprint on you. I remember at the end of Final Night, it ends with Superman and Batman on the roof of the Daily Planet together. And they're talking about Hal Jordan and the sacrifice that he made to reignite the sun. And Superman is far more forgiving towards Hal, whereas Batman kind of appreciates what he's done, but won't go so far as to forget what Hal had done prior to all of that as Parallax. And so again, you see that tension, but still that respect and the understanding between them. And the caption explains that essentially these are the two pillars of the DC universe, and everyone else follows the lead of one or the other. And the other thing that I always come back to is I've talked about this idea of keys to understanding the character of Superman. And I feel like there are at least three. One of them certainly is the Kents, right? How could somebody with the powers of a god possibly not misuse or abuse them, but rather use them to help people? How? Well, the answer is Clark Kent. Clark Kent raised by Jonathan and Martha. So I look at Jonathan and Martha as the first key to understanding Superman. Then as his journey progresses, right, he has this huge life, all these adventures across time and space. What keeps him grounded? What keeps him tethered to his humanity and the personal side? Lois. All right, so look at Lois as that other key. But then there's a third one, because even if Superman can be trusted, and we've seen plenty of stories that show how he earns the world's trust and becomes this champion, there's still always the risk that he could be corrupted, he could be mind controlled, he could be manipulated in some way. There would need to be some sort of fail-safe, right? And even if the people of the world are willing to take that risk, I don't know that Superman himself would. There's
Agreed.
a sense of responsibility that I think he would want to make sure there's some safeguard in place. But who could he possibly entrust that to? Not the governments of the world, for reasons that we're living through. So what could it possibly be? And then there's Batman, right? The one who he can say, and that story where he entrusts Batman with the kryptonite ring and all of that business, that was certainly a key part of the period of time when I grew up reading all of these comics.
Absolutely.
So that's always kind of first and foremost in my mind. But just kind of the idea, like, this is the guy he can turn to. And they're not, again, I know this varies depending on the era that we're looking at, but for me, it's like they're not necessarily pals, but there's something deeper between them. Like, I don't know how quick they'd be to go out and grab dinner together, but there's something that I think is far deeper between them, this brotherhood, essentially, and the fact that he's willing and able to entrust Batman with this. So I feel like that answers kind of another question about how could not even just the world, but Superman himself trust that level of power? Well, there's this safeguard in place with Batman. So that's kind of how I always look at it.
I commend your analysis, and the Kents and Lois. But then to your point, and opponents, whether it's Lex Luthor or Batman at different points in time, have always had different views of Superman. But you said it so eloquently. Superman himself has concerns that, what if I lose control? And the death and damage and destruction I could cause. I need someone I can trust who, is going to be responsible if I need to be stopped. So I do agree. I will say, though, and we're going to touch on this, and for the benefit of your audience, I'm 68. I've been reading comics now for 60 years. But I grew up with these guys, but when I grew up with them, they were best friends, right? And we'll see that as some of these, we discuss and converse on some of these stories. But I loved the evolution of all the stories, and we'll get to it more, the input of, say, John Byrne or Frank Miller. So I don't want to jump ahead, but
no, but that's a great point, just to see that evolution. And I will admit, this is funny. So I never purport to be an expert about any of this. As much time as I've spent reading and watching and discussing, I still don't hold myself out.
I don't know. If you're not an expert, I don't know who is.
Well, still, I still wouldn't say it about myself. But one of the things that I am always quick and happy to do is admit when I have a gap or I have a blind spot. And I was really struck by this when I started on this homework project, because I had read at least some of the pre-crisis Superman Batman stories, ones that you and I have discussed, for example. So I knew certainly what the vibe was of those stories, but it never, unless I'm just totally forgetting, I don't think the question of how they met pre-crisis ever even occurred to me. And I couldn't tell you why. I mean, maybe it's just because I had the John Byrne Man of Steel issue and Superman the Animated Series, that World's Finest 3-parter. Like, I had these modern era tellings of their first meeting just so cemented in my head. But I'm telling you, like, it never even occurred to me to ask, like, and that's why when we started going through all of this, I was like, oh yeah, like, this is actually a good question, but it never dawned on me. I can't tell you why.
And I was kind of prodding you periodically. Now, for me, and we're going to get into it, I grew up, and when I was young, and even when I was like 5 and 6, and my grandfather or my parents we'd go to a drugstore, or we'd go to at the train station a newsstand, I would see comics, and I would see the Justice League or World's Finest, and I always saw Superman and Batman on the covers. I can remember, though, in 1968, there was a World's Finest annual that had 2 of the stories we're referencing. But that's when I first read the first ever published meeting, and Anthony, it blew me away. I mean, because until I read it, I didn't realize, oh, wow, this is their first meeting. And to this day, I have tremendous fondness for that. I'm going to interject and throw a question. I don't know if you had an opportunity, but I asked you to check Cover Browser for the covers from World's Finest 2 to 70. Did you get a chance to do that?
I did, yes.
Weren't they beautiful covers?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
they tell a story in their own way.
Win Mortimer, a Canadian artist, did those. But when I scroll through all those covers, I mean, they're having so much fun.
I know they're playing baseball, and they're going swimming in the lake,
and they're driving race cars, and they're playing, like you said, baseball. They do show some heroic rescues, but they're flying kites, and then they're spoofing on the poor Shoeshine guy, right? They have a stand with Shoeshine, and he's got 3 colors: black, brown, white, and they show up with their blue, green, and red boots. Now, I loved those covers, but they put a smile on your face, but it gives you the illusion that they've been friends forever. And in reality, they never teamed up until one of the first stories we're going to discuss.
I know, it really is fascinating. So we'll get into our list, but let me just go through a couple of patron comments and questions. So our pal Rick says, I'm sure you'll list your favorite first meeting. For years, the only one I read was the first one from Superman number 76. in a copy of Superman from the 30s to 70s, and I read it so many times, but Man of Steel #3 by John Byrne is probably my favorite. Did you ever have, or do you have that trade, Superman from the 30s to 70s? I mean, it's long out of print now.
No, I don't. I have Batman from the 30s to the 70s, but for whatever reason, I wasn't able to get Superman from the 30s.
And then we have Jan who says, can't wait for this episode. I'll always be partial to the world's finest 3-parter from Superman the Animated Series. Eric says, I have an idea for yet another podcast episode, and I'm going to stop reading Eric's question because, Eric, what you suggest is something that I'm probably going to do at some point, so I'm going to keep that one. I'm going to keep that one under wraps for now, but it's an excellent suggestion, and you and I are on the same page here. And then one question to kind of tee us up here, Brian Dempsey asks, if a few years from now your son asked you how Superman and Batman met each other or asked to read the story where they first met, which story would you tell him or which issue would you give him to read? Which is something that I've certainly considered. And obviously the answer is I would sit him down and have him watch Batman v Superman because the kid's got to learn. No one stays good in this world. I'm just kidding. That's not what I would do. That's also not the point of that movie, but I digress. No, what would I say to him? It's funny because we've kind of already touched on this. While I was preparing for this episode, I was reading the 2-part World's Finest story by Mark Waid. I was reading it on my iPad and he saw me and he came over, and he's not yet at the point where he'll sit and listen as I read it to him, but he likes scrolling through and looking at all the art. So in a way, he's already kind of experienced that very recent 2-parter, which we'll talk about. I think on the comic book side, that's the one that I would have him read because I think it does a really nice job of tapping into all of the kind of core ideas that we're going to be talking about here, as well as synthesizing a lot of the past meetings between the two characters.
Yes, and there's some Easter eggs to some of the prior meetings.
Exactly. So there's that on the comic book side, but I think first and foremost, as soon as he has the patience and the interest to really sit through it, and this is also my favorite, so I'll give my answer now. My favorite out of all of these tellings, it is that DC Animated Universe World's Finest 3-parter from Superman the Animated Series. I think that strikes such a beautiful balance and is a genuinely compelling story and merges the two worlds and the mythologies in a really cool way. And certainly was formative for me as a kid watching it in the 90s for the first time. But for all the times I've gone back to it over the years, it's held up beautifully.
It stands the test of time.
So that animated 3-parter from the Bruce Timm verse, that's what I would hold up as my number one, and certainly one of the first things that I would have my son experience hand in hand with that Mark Waid 2-parter. Okay. So that's where I land. Do you want to reveal your favorite, or do you want to save it for the end? Do you have a favorite, I guess is another way to put it.
I'd like to answer at the end. I mean,
you got it.
I guess the thing I'll say now, and I'll think about it, but it's like asking a parent to pick their favorite child amongst many, right? And I really have to think about it.
So we are very shortly going to hit upon Superman number 76 from 1952, which is truly the starting point of all of this. But as far as some precursors, what's up?
No, I was going to...
I'm there, man. Don't worry. I got you covered. Covered. So All-Star Comics number 7 from 1941 in the Golden Age, right? The first time that these two appear in a comic together, in a panel together. Now, I did not have it in me to read the entire issue, but I did skim through it and I read the relevant pages. But essentially the setup for it is that the Justice Society is trying to raise $1 million for war orphans. And they're each tasked with raising $100,000. And Johnny Thunder just drops the ball and he doesn't have the money. And the rest of the JSA is sort of berating him a little bit. And they're like, what good are you and your Thunderbolt? And he's like, you can't say anything about my Thunderbolt. But he invokes that magic phrase, say you. And so the Thunderbolt appears and grants his wish because Johnny's like, if Thunderbolt were here, he'd bring our honorary members, Superman, Batman, and the Flash. And they each have $100,000. And that's exactly what happens. So you see the two of them along with the Flash in that panel together. I take it you're familiar with this issue?
Yes. Absolutely. This is where we were separated at birth, and by 30 years. But I do know the exact panel you're referencing. And at a different point in my life, I skimmed through that thing. Skimmed is the operative word. I didn't, but I know the exact panel. And as you said, while they were both honorary members, this is the first time they ever appeared in publication side by side. But I didn't dwell on that. I have the story, but I didn't have the discipline to read it for this get together.
Yeah, nor did I. And I don't know how much more it would have offered for our conversation. But just from my little bit of research, I mean, I love the JSA, but their Golden Age stories remain largely a gap for me. But my understanding is that Superman and Batman appeared very rarely in the title. Is that your understanding as well?
My understanding, there was kind of an unspoken instruction that once a JSA member got their own ongoing series, they would not publish them in this team book. So I think for the short period of time, the four honorary guys were Superman, Batman, Flash, and then Alan Scott, because they had their own ongoings. And I forget why. Maybe they felt that the presence of those big guns would be a detraction from those other people who didn't have other publication opportunities.
Boy, imagine if such a rule were still in effect now. How things change. But so you have this first on-panel appearance together in All-Star Comics number 7. And then we have World's Fair Comics numbers 1 through 3 from 39 to 40. And then the first 70 issues of the World's Finest title from 1941 through 1954. And so in all of these stories, you have them together on the cover, but separately within the pages of the books. So just totally separate stories.
It's wild. Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I thought about that driving over here. The only thing I can assign it to is there must have been, like I said, some unspoken protocol or rule, or also maybe the editors were very, very territorial about their characters. And they, aside from the Justice Society, you didn't see team-ups that in the 60s and in the Bronze Age and in the post-crisis that are much, much more prevalent. So there must have been where the editors, and I think during the Silver Age, there was a lot of territoriality where you couldn't use another editor's characters.
Gotcha. Now, we still have one more stop before Superman number 76, and that's the Adventures of Superman radio serial, and specifically the story Mystery of the Waxman from 1945. And this is heartbreaking that key chapters of this are just lost to history, apparently.
I couldn't agree more. My recollection is, I think it was a 12-part story, and only two episodes are available to, where the public can listen to them.
And they are out there. I found that, or actually you found them on YouTube, and I gave at least part of it a listen, particularly where Superman rescues a young boy he quickly comes to realize is Robin. And then they have a discussion about how Batman is missing. So you have that first meeting between Superman and Dick Grayson, at least, but not the entire story.
Where my recollection is, again, it was the radio show 1945, as you said. Superman finds Robin unconscious adrift in some sort of rowboat or boat. Robin, I think, his head had been grazed with a bullet and he was unconscious. And I forget, Superman and Jimmy and Lois, he took all of them to a doctor. And then somehow he must have done something where he got him out of the Robin costume and let the doctor check him out physically. But I do remember, I think the first 11 or 12 minutes of that, where Lois and Jimmy are in the mausoleum, I was set to throw in the towel, like at the 10-minute point. I mean, like, where is this going?
Yeah, I will be honest. I just sort of jumped around until I got to the Superman Robin meeting. So I didn't fully immerse myself in what was available.
You didn't miss anything with those first 12 minutes.
Yeah. But in any event, so they did have this first meeting on the radio show that's been lost to time. As far as we know, if anyone listening knows something contrary to that, please reach out. But that's our understanding. All right. Yeah.
Two things I'll say, try to make it quick. At first I was angry. I didn't have the first, meeting between Superman and Batman. I think it was smart to start out with Robin to really build up suspense for when Batman finally arrives. And I think at the end of the third episode, right, of the two, it's number 3, but there was only 2 available. Wasn't there like a wax figure of Batman or something like that?
Yeah.
And I thought this might have been a forerunner to the TV show Mystery in Wax. That was my speculation when they said, wow, there's a wax figure, boy, and it looks just like Batman. So to me, this reminded me of that TV episode we had discussed a few years ago, Mystery in Wax.
Yeah, I actually had a similar thought as I was going through this, or even just from the title of it. It's also funny, too, when Superman and Dick first meet, because Clark is there, and then Clark excuses himself, and then Superman appears, and he's like, Clark told me you wanted to speak to me. It's like, I guess Robin's still sharpening his detective skills at this point. But he's like, how do I know you're really Superman? And like, Superman flies around the ceiling
living room.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. I wish I had more to say, but obviously we were limited in terms of what we could listen to. But there's also that piece of this puzzle. But then in 1952, we have Superman number 76 by Edmund Hamilton and Kurt Swan, where Superman and Batman meet and discover each other's identities aboard a cruise ship where they have been forced to share a room together.
That's, yep. And I think, weren't they chasing a jewel thief or something like that? Or there was some sort of like fuel truck or gasoline truck that some thief had lighted on fire. And then that forced them to be in their superhero identities to put the fire out. And they know the jewel thief was on the boat. But then, to your point, yeah, each of them decided to take a vacation and go on a cruise, right? So Batman must have really cleaned up crime in Gotham City.
Yeah, I mean, literally, because in the opening scene,
Gordon,
yeah, he and Robin have apprehended someone, and Gordon says, well, that was the last one on the most wanted list. And Batman's like, all right, time for a vacation. It's funny because one of the other things that we're going to talk about, and actually we could do these hand in hand, or we could really just stay chronologically, but there's a Superman Batman annual written by Joe Kelly, drawn primarily by Ed McGuinness. That's a modern retelling of Superman number 76. And there it felt far less contrived. I felt like the setup made a lot more sense, where Clark was on the ship for a story, right? It was a bit of a puff piece, but he was sent on this cruise ship to do a story. And Batman Bruce was using this for cover, right? To preserve the Bruce Wayne Playboy persona, right? So at least it felt more in line with our understandings of these characters, especially Batman. But honestly, both of them in Superman number 76, they're both just full on, you're just taking a vacation.
Yes. Yeah. And I think even in 76, Lois is out to dinner the night before with Clark. And she goes, "Oh, I'll see you off tomorrow as you get on the cruise. I'll go with you and I'll see you off at the dock." Now, one thing I wanted to say, again, I read this when I was 12 years old, and I loved this story. But for 1952, it was tremendously of its time. I mean, I know my grandparents in the 50s would take a ship from New York to London or New York to Europe. So it was very much of the time. I remember being a young child, and my father worked in the airline industry, but they didn't start doing transatlantic flights until the early 60s or late 50s, right? I remember my dad told me stories about work he did in the early 50s when he would have to fly to Brussels, and what an arduous trip it was, because he would fly from New York to the furthest eastern point in Newfoundland, then fly from there to Ireland, and then take another plane from Shannon Airport in Ireland to London. So, and these were all propeller jobs. So this was very much of its time. And they didn't seem, their biggest concern when, hey, you guys got to share a cabin, their thought balloons were each, geez, I hope this guy doesn't discover my secret. Both of them had the same thought.
Yeah, it's when they're checking in, it's like, oh, we're overcrowded. You have to share a room. And yes, they both accept it so quickly. Again, the modern version of the story that we get is a lot more tension. It's very humorous. But yeah, these two guys just kind of go along with it. But it's funny too, as far as just being a product of its time. Like you said, Clark seemingly is on a date with Lois the night before he goes. And I'm saying to myself, maybe invite her along on the cruise. I know that would never happen, especially at that time.
1952.
But it's like, yeah, like the idea of, well, the two of them on a cruise ship in a room together. We couldn't have that. But these two guys together, that's totally fine. And of course, that calls to mind that funny bit that we always talk about from Adventures of Superman and those cereal commercials. It's like, you can't have Lois with Clark in the morning because what would that imply? But totally fine to have Jimmy. It's like,
breakfast with Jimmy. Yeah. We've discussed that before. And talk about a departure in social mores over the past 70 years, right? Yeah, and really the most powerful thing of this story was them discovering one another's identities.
Yeah, because there's this commotion outside, which you were addressing before, where there's this tanker that explodes, and it's this diamond thief who's using that as cover to steal this diamond shipment. And then later we'll find he's posing as the electrical engineer on the ship, and Batman is able to deduce this because he doesn't have the right footwear. So they put the pieces together. But that's what initially gets their attention, and they have to change into Batman and Superman, and they try to do this in the dark without either one seeing or hearing, I guess, as they're changing their clothes. But then the light comes in through the porthole, and they see and they realize. Now, I have a question, and I know I'm overthinking this, but it's a podcast, and that's what we're here to do. So, is it 100% clear to us as the reader that this is literally the first time that they're meeting? It's definitely the first time that they're learning each other's identities. It's definitely the first time Lois meets Batman, and she introduces Batman and Superman to each other, but I don't know. Is it crystal clear that they've never actually met before? Because when we get to one of these other stories later, it's easy to kind of chalk up one of these later ones. I'm talking about World's Finest number 94 in particular, where
or even 84.
84, yes, but there's at least there. It's like one of them knew, one of them didn't. But I don't know. I'm looking at like number 94 in particular, which we'll talk about as retconning their first meeting to earlier back. But I don't know. Is there a way to read this where it's like, no, maybe they've had some interaction before, and this is the first time that they're learning their identities?
You forced me, and again, I've said this on other podcasts, to your listeners, if I worked as hard in college as I do in studying and researching some of these things, I would have had a higher GPA. No, hands down, no question. I did think about that exact thing. Like, is it possible? And even when you look at that one panel you're referencing where Batman's in his costume and the light's right on him, and then all of a sudden you see like the head of Superman, is this only the first time they learned one another identities? And were there previous adventures where there were just two superheroes that were ignorant of one another's identities? I puzzled about that. My impression is that when this was published, it was kind of the first meeting, and they also simultaneously learned their identities. That's the takeaway I have from that story as it stands alone.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, when we get to World's Finest 94, the caption at the beginning says, whatever, like you saw the origin of their team up now, or the origin of them learning their identities, but now see how they first met. Something. But again, that could just be a retcon, right? Where now we're telling a different version of this.
And that commentary you spoke to, I think that was added when they did that annual as kind of like a hook to the reader. Yeah. But it does merit. I mean, you could make an argument either way. Like, look, they knew one another before as heroes, and this is the first time they're learning their identities.
In any event, I know, I think we're putting more thought into this than I think anyone involved did, but yeah, it's interesting. And the version of Superman and Batman working together here is very much in keeping with what I think we'll see throughout these pre-crisis stories, where they're pretty fast friends.
Oh, they are fast. I mean, they're buds right from the get-go. I think a couple of panels later, Batman says something like, well, Superman, you're the only one other than my assistant Robin that knows my identity. And don't worry, I'll safeguard your identity as well. So they're best friends, and they're both taken the high road. We're going to get to it much later about the impact and the different natures. But for me, and I am fanatical about the Silver Age World's Finest, especially written by Edmund Hamilton and Kurt Swan. I love those stories. But you see all the foundation of the tropes here, like, the partnership and the friendship and the collaboration. You also see the Superman, Batman, Lois, or Superman, Lois, Batman triangle. And you see the other thing where they each take steps to protect the other guy's secret identity. And you see those in a repeated pattern with a lot of the Silver Age World's Finest stories.
No, that's a great point, because going back to what I cited as my favorite first meeting, that animated series 3-parter, there you have that love triangle, and you have Batman or Bruce Wayne romancing Lois, and she even discovers his secret identity. And it's funny because at the time, in that era that I grew up in and then was watching this, that felt like more of an outlier, and it was based on that era. But yeah, to go back and see this and to have that element present there, was really, really interesting. And also too, I know this is a product of the stories of the time, but just Superman's attitude toward Lois, just this notion of like, oh, she's in my hair all the time, she's going to get in the way. And so he concocts this plan with Batman, like, why don't you pretend you're interested in her and I'll pretend I'm jealous, and that'll keep her busy, keep her out of our way so we can investigate on our own. It's like, okay. And of course she overhears this and she's like, I'll show them. And so she really plays it up and really fawns over Batman. And then Superman does have a few moments where he's like legit jealous.
You are so right. You are so right. Again, a product of its time. It was, to a degree, misogynistic, right? It was like, oh, she's just an airhead, typical female. She's bugging me. I got an idea. Why don't you put the moves on her, right? And then that'll sidetrack her and we can get our job done, right? And then you're right. And then Superman starts going, hey, she's shown a lot of interest in him, right? I'll juggle some icebergs.
Yeah, my favorite beat, I think my favorite beat in this is like in the midst of this entire investigation, Lois asks Batman, oh, can you perform at the show tonight on the ship and perform your acrobatics? And he does. And then Superman's like, I'll show them. And
I'll juggle icebergs.
I'm like, again, these going back and reading these Silver Age stories, I wish I had the personal connection that you do, right? You grew up reading these, you have these memories, this takes you back to your childhood, and you read these as they were coming out and they formed the basis of your understanding of the characters. Like, I don't have that, right? I'm looking at these from a completely different perspective, but I can still enjoy them in my own way. And part of it is the historical significance. And part of it is, and I say this with love, but the silliness of it and these things that really make me laugh, but laughing with it, right? Not laughing at it in a way that I'm putting it down.
And the other thing that caused me to kind of cringe, or I thought was awkward, was the very last panel.
Yeah, what the hell was that?
Yeah, I'll let you.
No, you please, you go.
Okay, so to your listeners, the last panel, and I forget, Anthony, was this like a 12-page story?
Yeah.
It was a real short one. But at the very end, the last panel is Lois and Robin, arm in arm, like, Robin's taking her out to dinner, and Lois goes, I'm not going to worry about you two guys. I met this interesting little chap, and he's taking me to dinner. So you got like this Lois hitting on this 15-year-old. It would not fly today.
I know, it's like he's a little boy. I mean, I get it's a humorous button, right? Because you have this back and forth with Superman. Although what's so funny throughout is that it never really seems to create any tension between Superman and Batman, or at least any way that they articulate to each other. Batman's just going along with this plan. He's just like following Superman's directions. Superman's feeling some sort of way, but it's mostly through the thought bubbles. But it's a funny button that it's like, well, she doesn't go off with either one of them. It's this third option, but it's like, was that the best we could do? Because he's a child.
Yeah. I totally, in reading it now, geez.
If they had spun it more as, I'm going to interview him, or I don't know, something like that. If it had
today, they would have.
Yeah. But it's okay. Or it would have been Nightwing. It would have been an adult. But in any event, that was their first meeting, their first true meeting. Superman number 76. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Now we can move ahead to World's Finest number 84 from 1956. That was the next one on our list, by Edmund Hamilton and Dick Sprang.
Can I call an audible and maybe throw an idea?
Yeah, go for it.
Would you, I would almost say, why don't we save 84, flip them, do 94, discussion of 94 first, and then do 84 and Adventure and Superboy.
Sure, yeah, I know. That when we get into the Superboy of it all, we get into the the stretch of this that I think I have the most problems with. So that's totally fine. So World's Finest 94 from 1958, again by Edmund Hamilton and Dick Sprang. So this seemingly retcons, if number 76 of Superman was their first meeting, then World's Finest number 94 retcons that first meeting to an earlier point in time. So we have in the present day here that Lex has escaped prison, and Batman and Robin are worried he's going to use kryptonite against Superman. So they go to Metropolis to offer their help, but Superman has this new ally, Power Man, this robotic figure, and they turn Batman and Robin away. Like, no, we got this. We'll take care of it. And so, of course, Batman and Robin are put off by all of this, and they decide they're still going to try to help. But as they're going about this, we have these flashbacks to what's now revealed to be the first time that Superman and Batman and Robin met, where Batman and Robin tracked stolen kryptonite, I guess, from Gotham to Metropolis, and intervened. Superman's hit in this flashback with liquid kryptonite that's shot at him, and Batman and Robin catch him. They wash him off in the waterfall. They have their first, and then we have our first meeting. What was your take on all of this?
I can remember reading this in, again, World's Finest 179, the very issue I purchased where I read the meeting on the Varania, right, the cruise ship. I read this one, and just like you, I was like, wow, who is this Power Man, right? And he's given the orders, right? And everything you said, I do remember being excited about, like, holy cow, all this kryptonite the paint hits him. The Batplane's able to swoop in. They get him with a grappling hook or something, and I didn't know Metropolis had these huge waterfalls. It must be like, up in Buffalo, New York, and they were able to fly through the waterfall and wash the kryptonite off Superman. I enjoyed it. It showed their partnership. I would say that kind of some of the things that intrigued me in retrospect were you saw very little of Lex Luthor. He was more just like a MacGuffin, I did like the artwork. I was impressed a little bit with the interest in architecture that both the writer and the artist displayed. Because for the benefit of the listeners, one of the things that was hard to find was, where are the bad guys? They had this big whirly-bird helicopter, right? And somehow they structured it into like a big Dutch windmill. But it was intriguing, the architectural view and how they structure, they displayed it. I found that interesting. And then Batman and Robin had these huge silicon shields, that were like 4 times their size, like Captain America's shield. But they used that to stem off some of the firepower being shot at them.
Yeah, that in the present day storyline. So essentially, these two run parallel, right? Where in both the past and the present, Superman wants to keep Batman and Robin at bay to protect them, but they ultimately use their ingenuity to help. So in that past story, they realize Superman doesn't want them to go after the bad guys because in addition to the kryptonite gun, they also have regular machine guns, which would take out Batman and Robin. So this then becomes the plan where Batman disguises himself as Superman, taking the gamble. I mean, it ultimately proves to be the right one, but taking the gamble that they would only use that kryptonite gun on him with the liquid kryptonite, which would have no effect, and then they could get the jump on the others.
Yeah, the two thoughts that kind of flabbergasted me were a more realistic reading. He does take a big risk, right? But once again, these tropes of each assuming the other guy's identities, right? Yeah. And then I realized in reading it for this discussion that one of Batman's greatest superpowers is being a super tailor, because he was, to the benefit of your listeners, Batman and Robin, even though they're pushed away, each of them is working to protect the other, driven by that motivation. So Batman and Robin kind of learn where the bad guys' headquarters are, and they figure, look, Superman, the kryptonite would kill him. I'll disguise myself as Superman. But apparently, for a creature of the night and dark, mysterious, he has the most colorful parachutes in the Batplane. Because Batman and Robin take these yellow, red, and blue parachutes. Batman sews them into a meticulous Superman costume, so much so that it fools the bad guys. Now, he must be a super tailor, right? That's my disdain, reading it now. Now, reading it as an 8-year-old, I loved it.
Sure.
But
speaking of Batman, we are recording this on the 85-year anniversary of the release of Detective Comics number 27. And people will hear this just a couple of days after. So to all of our fellow Bat fans, happy anniversary, happy 85 years. One of the things that I'm always so struck by whenever we look at these Silver Age stories involving Batman is just Superman's had his own evolution over the eras, but to me, not near as striking as Batman's. I mean, just the notion that, going back to the previous story we talked about, that Batman would just take a vacation. Like the notion that he would feel like crime is under control enough that I don't have to think about it for a little while and I'm just going to go take a vacation, let alone all of the tailoring and colorfulness and all of that. But it's just so funny. It's so divorced from this modern era that's so ingrained in me. So that's probably, I think that remains every time we look at any of these World's Finest stories. That's the thing that's most jarring to me is just the Batman. And while we haven't even yet gotten to the story where he's traveling to Smallville with his parents.
There's 2 stories like that. There's at least 2 stories. The last thing, I don't know if we closed it for your listeners, but this Power Man partner, at the very start of this story, Batman and Robin, like you said, learn that Luthor's escaped jail. He could kill Superman so they rush to Metropolis and they're pushed away. I've got a new partner, Power Man. But we learned that's strictly a robot, and Superman either had recorded messages or used ventriloquism. We never saw him again, Power Man.
Yeah. So that was World's Finest number 94. So now we'll jump back to World's Finest 84 from 1956. And then we also have Adventure Comics number 275 from 1960, and then Superboy 182 from 1972. And these 3 stories kind of roll back the first meeting more and more once we now are incorporating the Superman mythology and we have these earlier meetings in Smallville. I'll be honest, the first one I'm most okay with because I think it sort of fits well enough within what we've seen before, and I can sort of reconcile it. I think it's once we get to...
Boy, you and I are so similar.
Once we get to the Adventure Comics and Superboy issues where Superboy has his time telescope and he recognizes young Bruce Wayne. And it just, that's where I felt like, okay, this is a bridge too far for me, but we'll get to all of that. But so World's Finest 84, again, from 1956 by Edmund Hamilton and Dick Sprang. So right on the first page, Superman comes back from a mission and he encounters this bad guy, Thad Linus, right? Who blackmails Superman into leaving Metropolis for 2 weeks because he knows Superman's secret identity. And as soon as Superman sees him, he's like, oh, this guy, I knew he was going to come for me at some point. And so he accepts seemingly, right? And leaves. Even as Clark, I don't know why he could have stuck around as Clark, I suppose. But in any event, he's so honorable that he takes a leave of absence as Clark as well. I love Perry, where he's like, yeah, I can always spare you. It's like, my God.
And Anthony, I'm using my memory. I wasn't able to read this story, so I'm doing this off memory, and I'm following your lead.
Is this why you wanted to jump over it before? You're like,
No. I felt these 3 stories that we're going to hit in this sequence, each of them have a teenage Bruce Wayne.
Yeah.
In the first 2 stories, a teenage Bruce Wayne in Smallville with his parents alive, which flabbergasts me. But I do remember from kind of the encapsulated research I could do, even though Superman was forced out of Metropolis, he did secret things behind the scenes. Like if there was a fire, he'd activate a rainstorm.
Yeah, he was operating from a distance. So he didn't truly abandon the city. He was still helping, just not in public view.
Yeah.
But that gets the attention of Batman and Robin. It's like all of these, where's Superman? Superman hasn't been seen. All of these disasters are occurring. We have to go investigate.
Right. And I do remember, if I remember correctly, there's this fire, there's this big rainstorm. Lois is freaking like, where's Superman? He must be in trouble. So Lois complains to Perry White. Perry White, I think, calls Commissioner Gordon. And then Superman and Robin fly and land their plane on top of a roof of like a 4-story building. And they talk to, I guess, Perry White and Lois Lane. Well, don't worry, we'll find Superman. They start doing investigations.
So ultimately, Superman, Batman, and Robin come together, and Superman explains the situation. So essentially, Superman recounts what his version of events is from his time in Smallville with this Thad Linus. And then Batman recounts his, and we kind of fill in the gaps here. So I'll kind of merge them. But essentially, when Clark was Superboy in Smallville, Bruce Wayne and his parents, who are still alive, come to vacation in Smallville. And Bruce decides that he's going to try to figure out Superboy's secret identity to test his prowess as a detective. I mean, there's a lot of things, like the notion of an adult Batman taking a vacation. It's like, this doesn't feel like Batman, but Bruce's parents being murdered and that spurring his detective career and his motivation, it feels so fundamental that it's hard to kind of make any excuse for that. What was that about?
And Anthony, again, I haven't read this for, my God, over 55, close to 60 years. But in preparing for this, I did some web searches and I saw some panels. And I do remember they're on a porch. The Waynes are on a porch. And they're like, middle-aged, right? And the father's smoking a pipe. And Bruce kind of goes, hey, folks, I'm going to go into Smallville today. I want to see what I can learn about Superboy. And there's a big lake behind him. And I remember the artwork was good. And I remember some other stuff where, again, Bruce doesn't have that driving motivation by virtue of his parents' murder. It's just like, hey, I want to hone my detective skills. But he's very methodical, like, okay, I'm going to see who's flying where and what other boys are in their normal state while Superboy is doing his actions. And then if I remember correctly, I got to remember this. Bruce goes to Mrs. Kent and goes, hey, is your son home? And she goes, no, he's not, right? Meanwhile, Superboy burrows through, breaks into the basement, and comes upstairs and goes, no, Mom, I'm right here. And And then Bruce goes, "Oh, you're not the boy I'm looking for," right? Well, that's kind of weird. But I think Superboy had some rock fragments or dust in his hair. And then later on, I vividly remember this as a child, vividly. Bruce Wayne goes to the Kent's store to buy a bicycle tire. And Clark is convinced, oh, he's going to get me because he's going to know that crate is so heavy, only someone with super strength could lift it. So Clark kind of goes, hey, could you help me get this crate off the high shelf? And really, Batman faked him out. Clark, or Superboy, gives the perfect tire, not even asking the size of the tire. So Bruce figures, you know what? He could only deduce that with X-ray vision.
The fact that you are doing this from memory after decades is pretty astounding.
The whole bicycle tire. I remember discussing that with my brother.
Well, and then that also gives Bruce Clark's fingerprints. And then later at the end of the episode, there's a fire, and Superboy grabs the wood and leaves fingerprints on that, which Bruce grabs.
Right, and he throws it. He destroys those fingerprints.
He does, because what happens is earlier in the story, Thad sees Bruce investigating Superboy, and essentially is like, hey, let's work together and we'll figure out Superboy's identity. And that's what Superboy sees. And he thinks that this young boy and Thad are working together.
They're in collusion.
And he never realizes that's not the case. But when Batman recounts the full version of events, young Bruce Wayne quickly rebuffs this offer. So the two of them are not working together, contrary to what Superboy thought all along. So once we get to that fire, Bruce, to protect, because Bruce's whole thing was just to test his abilities as a detective. It was never to expose Superboy or hurt him in any way. So he throws the charred wood with Superboy's fingerprints into the fire. Now, I know I'm nitpicking this a little bit, but what bothers me about all of this is that Thad, as far as we know from both flashbacks that we get, Thad never knew that Bruce had Clark's fingerprints on the bicycle tire, that Bruce had the civilian identity's fingerprints in any way, shape, or form. So I don't understand exactly what Thad thought he was going to do with Superboy's fingerprints alone to prove his identity.
Eminently good point.
So,
I mean,
I don't know. And again, I'm probably overthinking this, but that was one thing that I thought of. But
eminently good point.
But anyway, so yeah, Bruce throws those into the fire. So Thad essentially has been bluffing. He's just bluffing. And yeah.
Why did he wait 15 years before triggering the bluff?
I don't know. Also, Superman, why don't you be like, well, all right, who do you think I am?
Or, see, you took it different. Hey, Thad, I got a mountain cabin for you.
Yeah, Adventures of Superman style. Exactly. I'm going to set you up here on this mountaintop.
Yeah, bring some warm clothes.
Listen, I'm going to pack some clothes. I'll come back with food. Don't try to climb down. I'm giving you a warning. Do not try to climb down. Famous episode of the George Reeves series, which we've had a lot of fun talking about over the years. And then the kind of the kicker to all of this is that Superman asks Batman, why didn't you ever tell me this? Right? Because Superman doesn't know that Bruce Wayne was that little boy in Smallville, seemingly working with that. But of course...
You mean that teenager?
The teenager. Well, that becomes a threat, especially when we get to Superboy 182 and you finally have the Wayne's murder. Bruce is much older than you typically see in these stories. But in any event, Bruce knows that's Superboy, right? But he never tells him about this hidden chapter in Smallville.
Right.
And essentially he's like, I didn't want to shake your confidence that I figured out your identity. He's like, I don't want to give you performance anxiety. He's like, I never told you this. It's like, I don't know. It is what it is, but it made me laugh.
Well, the other thing that makes me laugh, and I love Edmund Hamilton as a writer. I love him. But in the span of 6 years, he wrote 3 different origin stories. So he's really there's no homage to continuity. These are 3 very different stories about their origin.
But so this is the thing. Again, I am okay with this one that we just talked about because it's this hidden chapter from Smallville that Superman really never knew about, and Batman purposely kept it secret for a reason, whether it's a good reason or not. Well, your mileage may vary, but he kept it secret for a reason. So I'm actually okay with this. And that's why I go back to the question I posed earlier, where, especially since you have the same writer doing all these stories, like I wonder if Superman number 76 was really just meant to be when they learn each other's identities. And now in World's Finest 94, we're getting the first meeting. I mean, again,
I agree with you.
I think it's fine either way, but if we're really trying to string these together and make sense of them, and 3 from the same writer, I think that's kind of how they fit together.
I agree with you. I agree.
All right. So now we have our two. Oh, the last thing I want to say about World's Finest 84, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the Mark Waid story, but the fact that one of the methods that Bruce employs to try to figure out Superboy's identity is charting the flight path, right? And when we get to that Mark Waid two-parter, that's essentially the foundation of Batman's analysis in that case. So I just thought it was cool. And like I said, we'll talk about this more, but that Waid story, I feel like really, and this is not a surprise given his knowledge and love of DC lore, like really synthesizes so much of all of these stories that we're talking about.
Well said. Yeah.
All right. So Adventure Comics number 275 from 1960 by Jerry Coleman and George Papp. So in this one, Bruce and once again his parents moved to Smallville. Now we're not even just vacationing. Now we're like full on move there.
And there's no science on this, but in the story we just finished, I kind of had the vibe that in that story with Thad, Bruce and Clark were maybe 15 years old. In this story you're talking about now, I'm thinking they're like high school juniors or seniors. I think Bruce, to me, comes across a little bit older. But like you said, in this one, it's flabbergasting because the Waynes moved to Smallville. In the other one, they were just on a vacation. Here, they moved to Smallville. And, well, the other thing, I did read this as much as I could. They hone in on the first meeting with Robin. There's some crazy time telescope. There's some crazy time telescope where Superboy, I guess, is bored and goes, you know what? Let me see what happens in the future. Oh, here's this guy, Batman. Oh, we're going to be best friends.
Exactly. Yeah, I think in 275, if memory serves, like he's already met Robin.
Right.
And when he sees Bruce Wayne, again, he uses the time telescope and he puts it together. Right. And so he knows that this young boy will be Batman and they'll be these partners in the future.
And my memory of this, Anthony, is exactly what you said. He puts it together. And then there's like a panel where Clark is very thoughtful and contemplative, like, wow, I wonder if I'll ever meet Bruce Wayne now, before we become friends far in the future. Next panel, the teacher's going, students, there's a new student in our class. The Waynes have moved here, right? So literally one panel.
I don't know what the geography of the DC universe was at this point in time, but we talk a lot when we talk about the Smallville TV series, the Smallville's proximity to Metropolis and how it gets closer and closer over the years to the point where it's essentially a suburb of Metropolis by the end of the series. And I'm not saying that's the intention here, but kind of in my head, it's like, well, all right, if you kind of position them that, because it's like, why on earth would the Waynes go to Smallville of all places? But see, now this is then the other thing. In this version, Superboy's home base is Smallville. So like Superboy would be a place on the map for people, would it not?
You would think.
But now there's a lot more to say about Superboy, and audience, stay tuned because there's a larger exploration to be had here. But like I said before, these two stories, this is where it's a bridge too far for me, and especially all of this business with the time telescope. Like it's one thing for these two guys to have an early meeting in Smallville during the Superboy days, but for Superboy to have the level of knowledge of the future that he has, I just feel like it pushes it too far.
I totally agree. And I don't think they used that. They might have used that time telescope once or twice, but then they dropped it, which was good because it gave them too much. Like you say so eloquently, it was a bridge too far. I mean, substantially too far. one thing I did like about both the prior story and more so in this story, even though I had the vibe that Bruce was like a high school junior, maybe even a high school senior, there's some crazy stuff he does with a new temporary secret identity.
The Flying Fox.
The Flying Fox, which we got to get to in a second. But if I may, it did show off Bruce's prowess intellectually as a detective with deductive reasoning and with his physical gymnastics and stuff like that. They kind of gave a couple of panels where it did show up his athleticism, his gymnastic prowess, his deductive abilities. I thought that was consistent with what you'd expect from Batman.
Yeah, would I ever want to see the origin story flipped where he's already cultivating these detective skills and then his parents are killed like we see in these stories? No, but I guess if this is the realm that we're in, I don't know. It's interesting to consider, right? That the ability is there, but then it's the motivation that kicks in once his parents are murdered. So again, we could still make sense of it, but it's still, I really keep bumping into this. But yeah, so he shows up in Smallville and Alana is showing him her father's archaeological artifacts. And that ultimately becomes the basis of this Flying Fox costume when some criminals are causing trouble outside and he has to spring into action. And what sort of sets Bruce on the case to figure out Superman's identity, right, or Superboy's identity, is he wants a date with Lana. And that's the deal. If you figure out who Superboy is, I'll go out with you.
Yeah, I don't know how they'd handle that today.
Yeah, bartering for...
I mean, there's some subtext there. And then for the benefit of your listeners, this and the other story were the only two I could not read. So I Googled and I checked. I
don't mean to interrupt you, but this is an important point of this one, and we've run into this before. But the lack of availability of a lot of this stuff, and I don't want to harp on this, but out of everything that we're reading, I would say thankfully most of it is available on the DC app. I don't know, maybe some is on Superman Through the Ages. I'm not sure offhand, but most of it was available on the app. The next issue that we're going to talk about, Superboy 182, is in the Superboy Greatest Team-Ups trade paperback, which is out of print, but I was able to track down a copy on eBay. But there were a couple of issues, and actually, I think this one that you and I are talking about right now is probably the biggest example of it, where I had to resort to reading scans online, and I would very happily pay DC for a trade paperback, for an omnibus, for a digital edition. I have the subscription to the app. Like, I happily would pay this company to read these stories, but in instances where they're not on the app and they're not collected, or at least not collected in anything that's currently in print, there's really no resource. So when this has happened, I will Google Adventure Comics number 275 and read online. And there are plenty of sites where there are scans available. The quality varies. Usually it's not great, but at least it's something. At least I can see these stories for their historical significance. Anyway, I cut you off. I apologize.
No. Like I said, this is one of two stories that I did the same thing. I did not, I did not read it for free online. I got screenshots or pictures or images. I just remember, like I said, there were some clear pictures of Bruce in high school on, using the gymnastics equipment and showing off in the science questions. And again, I did get the vibe that, hey, Lana goes, you know what? If you figure out his identity, I'll go on a date with you. Now, the things that go through my mind, my memory is there were some hideous, like evil Mount Rushmore type things later in this. But the costume for the Flying Fox was one of the most hideous costumes you could imagine. I mean, I do commend George Papp, who was the artist for Superboy, tons of stories, and he would be very good at historical things. So if there was like, Spanish galleons or conquistadors or medieval costumes, he was very good at that. This was one of the most hideous costumes I could imagine. It was kind of like a maroon or burgundy suit and then a pale orange cape, and some like fox with a long nose. It was just, the flying fox was not intimidating or menacing.
No, not so much. And if I remember, I think Superboy uses his X-ray vision, right, and quickly sees that that it's actually Bruce Wayne underneath, which I guess more in the modern stories, we'll talk about that in greater detail, but just how they learn each other's identities in any event. Here, ultimately, Bruce is able to deduce Superboy's secret identity through this vocal comparison where he compares recordings of Superboy's voice and the kids at school and figures out that Clark is Superboy. And it's at this point where Superboy shows Bruce his future through the time telescope. Again, if I'm remembering correctly, but the ultimate payoff to this is Bruce doesn't want to know all of this. Of course, that's why this time telescope business is ridiculous. But he doesn't want to know what's to come. And so he asks Superboy to hypnotize him into forgetting all of this.
And they do it in Dr. Wayne's medical room, or his study at his medical clinic.
Yeah.
And they create some sort of weird fan with a whole bunch of lights and colors. And Superboy hypnotizes Bruce into washing this out of his memory.
Yeah. So it's like, I don't know, you could still sort of make sense of all of this continuity wise. Like, this is another, like, before you had an instance where Bruce knew he was in Smallville encountering Superboy, but Superboy didn't know who Bruce Wayne was. Now you have this story where
yep, they learn
where they learn the identity, and Superboy remembers this, but Bruce doesn't. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. The only thing, this was clearly not one of my favorite stories. This was substantially not one of my favorites. I didn't like the costume. I wasn't keen on the artwork, but I did like both this and the prior story where Bruce kind of willingly, I don't want to know the identity. Either like,
yeah,
he makes a conscious decision, you know what, there's risk with it, so I don't want to know it. So I was impressed with that.
Yeah, I do like that angle as well. So now, at last, we move into the Bronze Age with the last pre-crisis story that we have of the first meeting. And this is from Superboy number 182, 1972, by Leo Dorfman and Bob Brown. So now, at last, not that we're happy that this happens to the poor characters, but at last, the Waynes have been murdered. Bruce is a teenager, right? He's significantly older than we would typically expect. And he's also living with his uncle.
I know.
What's that?
Well, and a rude, way back in Superman 76, when Batman's eradicated all crime, Robin goes, hey, I'm going to go upstate and visit some relatives. Well, where were the relatives when your parents fell off the trapeze, right?
I know.
And here, like you said, he's living with his uncle. Where'd that come from?
I know it doesn't take away from the tragedy, the shock, the horror of his parents being gunned down in front of him. But nevertheless, I feel like it at least lessens the impact to some extent if there's this other family member who steps in immediately. But I was very surprised. Again, Bruce vacationing with his parents in Smallville, Bruce moving to Smallville with his parents, Bruce living with his uncle after his parents have been murdered when he's a teenager. All of this was just kind of surprising, but it makes it fun and interesting to go through these things because, again, I was genuinely surprised by a lot of this. But so Superboy learns of the Waynes murders and he goes to Gotham to help. Like, he's really, I think in both of these stories, but especially this one, is really trying to kind of guide Bruce along. I mean, I think my biggest takeaway from Superboy 182 was just how angry, vengeful, and downright bloodthirsty this young Bruce is, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. I read this. I have the same book. I got the same book. You referenced the greatest team-up stories of Superboy. And I think you might have interviewed the writer. Did you interview Leo Dorfman?
No. Well, he's long since passed away, but his son is actually a faculty member at the law school where I work. So I've spoken with him, and yeah, exactly.
Okay. In reading this, I think the trigger point was exactly what you said. It starts out where Clark and Jonathan are like organizing some stuff in the Kent store, and they're wrapping some stuff. And Clark finds some newspapers that are a couple of months old that reference the Wayne murder. And he goes to Gotham to help out. And again, this showcases, Bruce is now, the murder has motivated him. But again, and now it looks like the parents were killed when he was definitely like a high school senior, older.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. And you and I, we did a lengthy episode years ago now on the tellings of Superman's origin across time and media and how things shift, like what elements remain constant, what changes. And perhaps there's a similar kind of analysis that could be done on the Batman front as well. We'll have to stay tuned for that. But yeah, so again, just kind of how vengeful, and Bruce is working on this case of the Zodiac killer. Now, help me out with my history on this. How does this line up with the real life Zodiac killer?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. The real life wasn't that Zodiac killer in California, and there was a pattern, and I think he kind of like tormented the police, giving them clues. Mm-hmm. For the benefit of your listeners, in this story, I guess there's a journalist who's almost fired or removed from his job, and he starts planting evidence at certain murders to create it increases his ability as a journalist to write these stories about these clues.
Right. He invents a Zodiac themed serial killer where these clues tied to the Zodiac calendar appear at all of these crime scenes. So it seems like it's the serial killer. And one of the crime scenes was the murder of the Waynes. So Bruce thinks his parents are victims of this killer. But yes, as we find out at the end of the story, it's really just this opportunistic reporter who is going to existing crime scenes and planting these clues to make it
for his own benefit. Yeah. Again, this one did early on show the athleticism, and now Bruce is, like you said, obsessive, and he's like very, very belligerent, and he's Old Testament. Now, what I found interesting was, and this is clearly Superboy hanging out a lot with the Legion of Superheroes. Did he use the time telescope here and come up with the idea like, oh, he'll be Batman in the future?
Yeah.
And he created a pretty interesting costume, but Superboy wanted him to be Bat Lad.
Yeah, so why are you calling me Bat Lad?
I'll be the executioner.
Yeah, it sets him up with that proto costume, right? Because Bruce comes up with his own thing, but it's not effective, so Superboy guides him along.
Yeah, I mean, the costume with the absence of the ears, it looked very much like the modern Batman costume, except that instead of gray, it was purple or something. But Superboy, hey, Bat Lad, we can team up. Get out of here. I'm the executioner.
I think, and I don't mean to keep beating up on these stories. I think I very much, not only don't I mind, but I actually quite like the idea of these characters intersecting with each other at earlier points in their journey. And we'll talk about that more now as we segue into the modern era, post-crisis and beyond, whatever we're calling the current time that we're in. But I like if that happens when they're more or less on an even playing field. And Superboy's deep, detailed knowledge of the future, to me, just undermines that. And that's what I don't like about it. Had Superboy encountered young Bruce without the knowledge of what they would become, I think that's far more compelling. But this idea that he's playing God, essentially, right? Like trying to guide him along because he's seen what the future is. I really don't care for that. So that was the aspect of those couple of stories that really just didn't do much for me.
I totally agree. I mean, this craziness of him using the time telescope and having knowledge of the future, I think is detrimental.
Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah.
Hello, I'm Daniel Cohen, former film editor of thepopbreak.com, and I've got a Batman podcast for you. We discuss Batman's past, present, and future, and do a lot of rankings episodes. Yes, we rank the movies, villains, but that's not all. We even ranked all the Batman movie trailers throughout history. Yes, we ranked Batman trailers. I dare you to find another Batman podcast that did that. So join me and frequent hosts Alex Marcus and Bill Bakken, as well as a plethora of Bat guests, as we discuss Batman and plenty of DC on film as well. Also, fair warning, I'm a BVS fan, but don't let that scare you away. Trust me, I get mocked and ridiculed more than the Martha line for taking that stance. So relax and tune in on the last Tuesday of every month on the Pop Break Today feed.
Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. With more than 40 years and a new second location to its name, Acme is a multiple-time Eisner Award nominee. The shop features a significant contemporary and vintage selection, as the Acme team uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available anywhere via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. All right, shall we now move into the post-crisis era?
Please.
All right. So we actually have a final patron question. This is from our buddy Chase. Chase says, I enjoyed the way Superman and Batman met in John Byrne's run. Batman's moral ambiguity and cleverness when he tricks Superman with the bomb threat is entertaining. It makes this Superman seem initially naive or uptight, but it's enjoyable to see him grow from there, along with his friendship with Batman. Do you think Byrne's characterizations of the two might have been inspired by The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, since it was releasing a few months prior? I actually did, and it's funny, I'm kind of forgetting right now, but I did do some research a few weeks ago about if Byrne had commented on any of this. And I do believe there are, don't hold me to this, but I really would need to double check this, but I think there were interviews where Byrne talked about essentially either admiring Miller's work or just kind of taking some sort of cue from it. So I think, to Chase's question, I think perhaps at a minimum. I don't know if you have any take on this.
Yeah, this intrigued me, and I could see great similarities between The Dark Knight Returns and this Man of Steel #3. I could see great similarities. From the tiny amount I knew, I think they were only published about 3 months apart.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Byrne would have had time to.
Yeah, I mean, unless it was something that had been discussed or something.
Yeah, that's it. I didn't think of that until you just said it. If they had both been somewhere and they shared ideas, 6 months earlier, clearly there's a common theme.
Yes.
And I will say, when I read this story, when it was published, I didn't like it at first. And my whole thoughts and opinion changed. But I didn't like it because it violated everything I grew up with, where they were absolute best friends, unconditional best friends. In retrospect, this really does show that, based on their worldviews and their nature and just their innate personalities, you got one who is hope and inspiration, and you got another one that functions through fear and intimidation. So their natures are so different. It would produce friction. That being said, I thought it was fantastic, and it was done at the right point in time post-crisis, because the reader wanted more intelligent stories. Some of the stuff we read earlier was really written for 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds. Here, even I, who was I was 30 years old, I enjoyed this story. Not so keen on Magpie, but it does show the difference in their natures, and it's a starting point for them to incrementally gain respect for one another over time. So I could see them starting out friction between them and each not liking the other.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. Thank you for answering that. I was going to ask you how you felt, because having grown up with them as chums, right, and really not having that friction, to now segue into this, I imagine that it could have been jarring, especially reading this in a vacuum. Although, even by the end of this, they have come to an understanding, though they're not buddies. Batman even has a line, in another reality, maybe we could have been friends, which again is a nice nod to the pre-crisis era. Now, of course, in the years to come, you would see that relationship continue to grow and develop. Again, maybe not even to the point where they're buddy, but there's definitely a very deep bond and respect and working relationship between the two of them. But you didn't know that, right? As you were reading Man of Steel #3 in 1986. So yeah, no, I can imagine that it probably took a minute to kind of warm up to
For me, it
to
was
that
a
idea.
kick in the gut. It was because, I mean, such a departure from that one panel in Superman 76 where, hey, you know my identity and don't worry, I'll protect yours. Immediate, unconditional friendship. But in retrospect, I commend Byrne and I commend Miller because based on their natures, these guys, they would have each questioned the other and had hesitancy to work with the other. And all Batman probably would have been super disdainful of Superman's operating style.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that in terms of how much, if any, tension there should be between the characters, we see a bit of a range, certainly even just through these modern stories. But I think what's set up here, it's not quite yet maybe the sweet spot, but I think it's definitely the starting point for it, because I think it is natural that they wouldn't immediately fall in line with each other. And so I think this does an effective job. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things I was struck by was Superman shows up in Gotham. He's not there to talk. He's there to just bring this guy in and calls him outlaw. Or like just from the jump, he grabs the bat line and he's just ready to bring him in, haul him in.
Agreed. It reminded me a little bit of what you had educated me on the Golden Age Superman. Like, you know what? Job's got to be done. I'm going to do it, right? I don't like those tenements. They're down. And you're absolutely right. He comes in not touchy-feely, or he comes in like, look, this guy's an outlaw. I got to pick him up and throw him in jail. And it did kind of portray Batman's intellect, with the facade about, hey, you touch me again, and a bomb's going to go off, and an innocent person's going to die. What you come to realize later is Batman was, I guess he's so tenacious, he's going to kill himself just to prove a point.
Yeah. Which I do think that whole bomb trick, it was so clever because it shows Batman's ingenuity. It feeds into why there would be this animosity between them, especially from Superman's perspective. But then that turn at the end of, oh, you wouldn't actually threaten an innocent life. You put your own life
at
on
risk.
The line. So kind of helping to now forge that respect between them. I think, and you alluded to this a minute ago, I think the biggest knock against Man of Steel #3 is Magpie.
I agree.
The fact that for their first team up in the post-crisis era, this is the adversary that they're pitted against, this museum curator who's gone crazy and she's robbing across Gotham. It's a bummer. Now, to Mark Waid's credit, he found a way to, I think, very seamlessly weave Magpie in that two-parter that we'll talk about at the end. Once again, bringing in elements from so many of these different stories, but she's not what that story is about. Whereas here, again, she's
an
the
Easter
villain
egg
of the piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
I was disappointed with her. I didn't think she had the stature or the presence. I mean, she, to me, was a grade F+ villain. I'm just not impressed with her as a villain. But how he put the two in tension and in friction and in disagreement, I think in retrospect was a smart move for the time, because it opened the door where they could, and we as the reader could see their professional relationship evolve.
Yeah. The other thing I think I was struck by was how they don't initially frame this in terms of methods. It's initially, hey, outlaw, you're coming in. And I think Superman even has a line about, even though I've sometimes been accused of operating outside the law, like something to that effect. But Superman still is kind of presented here as
an agent of the law.
As an agent of the law and of the status quo. I mean, I guess, again, looking at that commonality between this and The Dark Knight Returns, they definitely do feel in keeping with one another. But then as the issue goes on, there is more of a discussion about methods and cleaning up the city and how pervasive Gotham's problems are, especially when we get to the end where it's kind of laid out a bit more. So we do get into that. But yeah, it was just, I think more than anything, what I was just struck by was just from the jump, it's like, you're coming in, outlaw.
Oh, yeah. No procrastination. No, like, oh, maybe there's another side to this, or maybe there's something I'm not realizing. No.
Yeah.
Grab him. Check that box. Done.
Because even when we get to Batman v Superman, and don't worry, audience, we just had a very lengthy episode, a discussion about Batman v Superman. I'm not going to turn this episode into that, but we'll touch on it and we'll get Rich's take. But, one of the things there is like in that movie, Batman at that point, he's branding criminals. The criminals are going to prison and being murdered. So
he's
essentially
like the Phantom,
marking them for death. But even then, Superman gives him a warning. He's like, the bat is dead, bury it. Basically, don't make me come back and have to talk to you again. But it's not like, oh, I'm going to haul you in. So like I said, that's what I was just kind of so struck by here was how, just kind of how decisive Superman was.
And take no prisoners, right? Look, I've made my decision and now we're going to do it my way.
Yeah.
As you spoke, what I want to do for my own self-knowledge is when in the future, I want to find what was their post-crisis, what was the next story where they interacted? I'd like to see whoever wrote, I don't know who it was, but I'd like to read it to see, do they still have that hesitancy and suspicion of the other, and is there friction? Because they did set the stage where we as the reader could see the evolution of their professional relationship. So I want to find out what was the next story after this one. I don't know what it was, but
it comes up. I'm 99% sure we talked about it and we did one of our Triangle era discussions. But because I don't think we're too far removed from the Kryptonite ring business. But in any event, actually one thing though, and I'm forgetting now with Man of Steel #3, is there any discussion of Superman trying to deduce Bruce's identity? Like, is there any talk of him using his X-ray vision?
I got to confess, I got confused with these things. I know there's some stories about this time where Batman has lead lining.
Yeah, the Superman Batman annual by Joe Kelly, that's a retelling of Superman #76. There, the cowl is lead lined. I
think there might be lead lining here.
Maybe we'll have to double check, but yeah, I was just kind of curious about that because then when we get to the Mark Waid World's Finest story, Superman just respects his privacy and doesn't use his X-ray vision. Whereas again, in that annual, there's a specific line about the cowl being lined with lead.
Yeah, you got me intrigued.
My memory, I just don't know if it's addressed in the Man of Steel issue, but I could just be misremembering. We'll check after an audience reach out. So that's Man of Steel #3. So really, it's just a kind of a foundational building block for what this post-crisis dynamic will be like. Now, that's 1986. 1997, we have the 3-part World's Finest storyline from Superman, the animated series. Now, did you get a chance to take a look at that or no?
No, I didn't. I mean, whatever we do is going to be off memory. I loved that, and I think it stands the test of time, but I'm going to let you lead, and I'll...
No, I'll just say, again, I think it's the sweet spot for me and clearly from a lot of folks who have reached out. I posted on social media last night. I was like, what's your favorite? And that was probably the front runner in terms of what people cited. Just a couple of minor things, not even related to the first meeting. But in the first episode, Lois is on a plane. I think it's Air Force One, but she's on a plane that's hijacked by terrorists. And Superman intervenes, and the first thing he does, he rips the door off the plane to get inside. And I'm thinking, A, that's dangerous, and B, how times have changed, because now if you're on a Boeing airplane, that's just a standard feature. The door will come right off. But then, he comes onto the plane, and the climax of that sequence, and I don't know, maybe you even remember this, Rich, is that Superman is standing there, and one of the terrorists is like flying towards Superman, and Superman clocks him. And I'm saying, how is this guy not dead?
How is he not paste? How is he not gray matter spread all over?
Yeah. Again, I really do promise I'm not turning this into a Batman v Superman discussion again. But there was one aspect of the BVS movie that for all that we talked about, we didn't talk about this because I guess I didn't realize how much of a bone of contention this was. But early in the movie, when that African warlord is holding Lois and then Superman flies down and intervenes, and Lois, kind of drops her arms, and then Superman super speeds and grabs the guy and they go through the wall, right? I had a lot of people after we did that episode, they're like, oh, he killed that guy. I don't know. In my mind, this is how I look at it. It happened so fast, so we don't really see. I feel like I would imagine Superman like bear hugged that guy such that at least one of Superman's arms, if not both, were between the guy and the wall. I'm not saying this guy walked away unscathed, but I don't think he was paced. I will say that the speed would be my biggest concern because Superman hits him fast. But as far as going through the wall, again, I look at it as Superman breaks the wall and he's holding the guy while he does it, as opposed to him smashing the guy through the wall. And I know as I'm saying this, people are disagreeing with me, but I guess my read on that wasn't, oh my God, he killed this guy. However, I look at this World's Finest episode, I'm like, this guy who got clocked in the face by Superman at that high speed, probably not doing so great.
True.
But what I think and we won't spend too much since you didn't get a chance to look at it. We won't spend too much time. And we covered this when we did our Superman, the Animated Series mixtapes. But one of the things that was so cool about this, unlike the friggin' Magpie situation, is here you had Lex and Mercy and you had Joker and Harley. So you had the heavy hitters in terms of the villains.
You had the preeminent villains teaming up. The top of the line villains for each character. Like you said, Joker and Harley and Mercy and Lex, right? I loved, my best memories of this are, there's that one scene, right, where Batman is on some roof ages away and he's looking through binoculars at Clark. And Clark uses telescopic vision to look back, and he sees his identity. I think
he had discovered it in their previous meeting.
So they each, and Bruce kind of gives like a tip of the hat to Superman. I also loved the scene when they're talking, right, and they're talking about Lois, and one of them says, "Well, you know what? Of our identities, she likes." For each of us, she likes one of our identities.
Yeah, she likes Bruce, but not Batman, and Superman, but not Clark.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
I feel like this three-parter really had everything. You had, again, the heavy hitters in terms of the villains working together. Joker steals this jade statue in Gotham that's actually made of kryptonite. So it's like this 20-pound chunk of kryptonite that he promises to use to kill Superman in exchange for money from Lex. So you have that, you have this love triangle, you have Clark and Bruce meeting, you have Superman and Batman meeting. I think it just kind of, it was really kind of firing on all cylinders in terms of establishing those dynamics and hitting all those beats. The first time that they meet, Batman is roughing up some folks in a nightclub, right? And then Superman's there and he goes to reach for Batman and actually takes Superman by surprise and just flings Superman across the room. And you feel the surprise and the frustration from Superman. And I don't know if you remember what happens next, but he shoves Batman hard, I do. Hard against the wall.
Yeah, it's almost like, not only did you surprise me, but you took me down a peg. And it was almost like his ego was like, wait a minute, this doesn't happen to me.
This is one of my takeaways when we did not only our Superman animated mixtapes, but we also did a Justice League and Justice League Unlimited mixtape episode where we looked at key Superman-centric installments. And one of the things that I said in that episode, and that remains kind of top of mind, is I really look at this Bruce Timm, Paul Dini iteration of Superman as kind of a spiritual successor to the George Reeves version, especially the early George Reeves version, where he's tough and he does get angry sometimes.
And that first year is my favorite. That George Reeves, I mean, like I said, the real Clark is the real deal, and Superman is just an extension of Clark. But
that shove that he gives Batman kind of felt in keeping to me with like that early George Reeves Superman. And then he very quickly X-rays Batman and realizes that he's Bruce Wayne. And then unbeknownst to Superman, Batman places a tracker on his cape. And that then takes us to the end of the episode where Clark sees it, uses the telescopic vision. I know they had a lot of ground to cover. They had 3 episodes, but it was a lot of ground to cover. I prefer the stories. And again, I keep citing this World's Finest two-parter that we'll talk about, the most recent telling of the first meeting. But I like when Batman needs to use his detective abilities to figure out Clark's identity. I mean, I guess you can argue planting a tracker is something, but it feels, I guess, Superman using the X-ray vision, that's a pretty quick shortcut to discovering the identity, but that's the ability that he has, and I can go with it. But for Batman, I like him to need to work a little bit harder and to be able to do that, to deduce the identity. Just kind of, if there's one thing, I love this three-parter to death, but if there's one thing, it's like, I would have liked if he had to actually figure out more, as opposed to like, boop, and then I follow him home.
And we're going to touch on this again, but like that one story from the 50s, where again, Bruce as a teenager kind of like triangulates Superboy's flight patterns. We're going to touch on it in the Waid story. So it does speak to Batman's deductive, his analytical abilities, his intellect. I think, but as you said, that 1997 animated show stands the test of time. It still holds up well.
It does. I mean, it's crazy to think how old it is.
I also think, though, they almost needed to use the tracker from a time standpoint, because I think if they elongated it, they would have had to come up with other contrivances to figure out how he could deduce.
I think there were certain, you think about how they break the story and what they want to have happen by the end of each episode. And yeah, I think by the end of part one, it's like they have to have met and learned each other's identity, and then we move forward. And again, as you move forward through this three-parter, they each save the other, and you see that respect, grow between them. One of the first things that Superman says, I think during that nightclub meeting, is, "I won't have vigilantism in my city." So again, this is another instance where, we only get so deep in terms of disagreement over methods per se. A lot of the animosity, I think, does stem from the love triangle, probably more than anything. But that line about vigilantism is interesting, and I guess it tracks because Superman does work alongside the SCU in the city. I mean, he's not like an officially deputized member, but in the Final Night thing, wasn't there a story where Superman is surrounded by a number of legionnaires, and someone comes, I don't know if it's an alien race or someone from Atlantis or something like that, and Superman says, "Hey, I'm Superman. I'm here with the Legion of Superheroes, and I'm a special deputized agent of the Metropolis Police Department. So for your sake, I hope you can come in peace." And I think Byrne also in The Man of Steel referenced him as a special deputy of the Metropolis. Oh, so yeah, maybe at least in the comics they got more explicit. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't remember them getting that explicit in the animated series, but maybe they did at some point. But whether it was formalized or not, like clearly he has a working relationship with this law enforcement body.
And I attributed some of this just to his upbringing by the Kents, who I think, if you look at the conservative, the Midwest and stuff like that, even my memory of many times going back to the presidential elections with Richard Nixon, the Midwest was always more conservative, more law and order oriented. So literally this minute, as I'm saying that out loud, I kind of ascribe some of that to this, his resentment of people taking the law into their own hands.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, it's like, but he's doing the same thing. But it's like, again, he has more of this relationship with law enforcement. I mean, Batman does as well, but it's more on the side.
And also, Batman's whole forte is based on fear and intimidation.
Yeah.
So, if you got the urban myths and the rumors, this might be just some nut job, wacko.
It's funny, and this goes back to one of our patron questions from the beginning, talking to my son, who's 4.5 now, about these characters. And I think it was when I was getting ready to do the Batman v Superman episode where I was telling him, because he knows like daddy podcasts, and I'll tell him what I'm going to be talking about. And I think I mentioned Batman versus Superman, and whether he asked or I just started explaining about why but I remember him asking, like, why don't they get along? Like something to that effect. And I was like, all right, how do I explain this? And I kind of framed it in terms of, well, they're both good guys, but they go about it in different ways. I'm like, so Superman just tries to help everyone. Batman tries to scare the bad guys. So helping versus the fear. And that's kind of what I tried to boil it down to. And I think it landed. You got where I was coming from with it. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, especially in all these modern stories, that's definitely, I think at the basis of a lot of this. We could talk about the 3-parter forever, but those were kind of the main most salient points that I wanted to mention. That was 97. Then in 2003, we have a 2-page story in Superman, Batman, Secret Files and Origins by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, our creative team on the beloved Superman for All Seasons, which we very recently did an entire episode on. And it was absolutely magnificent to go back and revisit that. But there's just this beautiful 2-page story, and it's collected in the most recent For All Seasons trade paperback, which is great, where young Clark and Pete Ross are playing baseball, and they see this fancy car that's broken down, and Alfred's outside, he's changing the tire, and there's this, sad, lonely boy, Bruce Wayne, sitting in the car. And just like the Superman Batman series that Loeb wrote, you have kind of the dueling narration as both of these now men are thinking back to this moment. And, Clark is like, I wonder, I wanted to ask him to come play with us. Like, I wonder if that would have made a difference. And then Bruce's narration is, my life had changed too much. It wouldn't have made a difference.
Well, but just before he says that, he says, I wish they would have asked me.
Right.
But it wouldn't have made any difference. My life had changed. But I thought that 2-page story was so heartwarming and so touching. And I got to tell you, that last panel, when Bruce's last words, the juxtaposition of Clark with his thought balloon going, maybe we would have changed things if we asked him. And then, especially when Bruce goes, I wish they would have asked me, but it wouldn't have changed things. Right? But I felt a degree of emotion for Bruce, the pain he was experiencing. But once again, it kind of shows the optimism of Superman and kind of the negativism of Batman.
Yeah, it's quite effective for such a short story.
2-pager.
Yeah, and this kind of, I guess this was a question that I wanted to ask. I was maybe going to save it for the end, but maybe this is a good place for it. And I don't even know how to phrase this, but when we think about the first meeting between Superman and Batman, like, as evidenced by this episode that we're doing as we're approaching the 2-hour mark and we still have a few more to get through, there have been all of these different versions of it. And even just in the modern era. And in fact, actually, when we get to Superman number 710, which is during that grounded arc right before the New 52, that's okay. But Superman and Batman have a discussion. We get yet another past experience between them, but they both acknowledge, Superman has a line about, what happened, right after we first met. And I think it's Bruce, or I might be flipping the two of them, but they're like, oh, was it the business with Magpie or on that cruise ship? So it's like an attempt to sort of
say they
juggle all of them. And then of course a story like this, where it's just this, not even an interaction, right? There's nothing between them other than the what?
No. I'm super excited for a couple of stories we're going to tell shortly after this, because
yeah, in Batman, Superman during the New 52, we see the Earth 2 versions of these characters, and it plays
leverages
with that moment.
It leverages this moment, and it expands on it.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. I guess my question is, do you like that their first meeting changes so much? Do you wish that there was a more, I'll put it this way, like, do you wish that there was a more firmly established, like, this is how these characters met? Or do you like that we've gotten all of these different spins on it?
Okay, so I'm gonna pick something in the middle, right? I'm not opposed to, hey, this is the definitive meeting, but here's a couple of earlier meetings, as long as they're consistent. Here, I think there's been such a potpourri and so many variations of this, it's lost its effectiveness. So if there were like, hey, this is the official where we learned our identities, but here's a couple of backstories that complement the definitive origin, I'm cool with that. But I think we've got like on the order of 14 different first meetings, and I loved many of these stories. And I'm willing to tolerate, okay, this is this universe's version, or this is this writer's view. But I think there's too many of them, and I think it dilutes the value.
Yeah, I think, I guess I kind of land in a similar place. Like I don't love if we have so many different versions of how they meet as adults, but where I think my position has changed a little bit, I now kind of like this idea more than I did before of there's this almost interaction when they're boys in Smallville, right? In the Jeff Loeb, Tim Sale thing. When we get to Superman 710 during that grounded arc, there's a flashback to when they were both traveling the world and they had an encounter together. Then in the present, maybe it's on the cruise ship, maybe it's with Magpie. I don't know. But this notion that these two pillars of the DC universe, these almost mythological figures at this point, right, in the DC universe, that their paths have intersected at various points, at key junctures along their journey. Not if we're in the Superboy realm where he's got the time telescope and he can see the future clearly. I don't like that. But if there are kind of these intersection points, and maybe it's something that they both remember, maybe it's something that they didn't even realize they were crossing paths. Maybe one of them remembers and one doesn't. Maybe they both remember, but for whatever reason, they never talk about it. But like, and maybe this is the Grant Morrison fan in me, but I just kind of like this idea of these various intersection points along this like mythological journey that each one of them is going on. So yeah, when we're in the present, do I need to see the first meeting retold so many times? Not really, but kind of these intersection points along the way. I think that's what I kind of like.
I like what you just said. Like if there's a very definitive or a very important, very definitive story, I kind of like a little bit of a backstory that where you kind of, hey, let's, if they officially met when they were both 30 or 32, well, hey, if something happened when they were both in their 20s, that was an intersection point. I like that phraseology. If that enhances the story, I'm all for it. But just to overdo it, like you said, the time telescope and some of this other stuff where they were just kind of throwing it against the wall, I'm not a fan of that.
And this podcast is made possible by the support of our Patreon community. Sign up for a monthly or annual membership at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato and choose from a range of rewards. This week, I want to spotlight our Super Friend tier, aka our sponsorship package. Promote your comic shop, convention, creative project, website, or anything else you want to spread the word about. Sign up today, and thank you to all patrons. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show, too. Many of you have already used this code, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Now, going back to 2006, that Superman Batman annual by Joe Kelly and Ed McGuinness that we've been referencing, that's a modern retelling of Superman number 76. Genuinely funny. I mean, it was so funny.
I couldn't agree more. This story is probably my favorite of everything we've read. And I commend Joe Kelly. I had some laugh out loud moments. The pictures he painted with certain words. And as you say, there was more of a contemporary, thoughtful context for this. Like Bruce is going on the cruise as, well, people will think I'm on the boat, but I've got the bat sub ready to go back. And this will help separate suspicions about Bruce Wayne being Batman. But I laughed out loud. This was a well-written comedy that tapped into the characters so well. I mean, even from early on, one of the first panels, I guess there was a dimensional warp opens up, and Superman and Batman are all fighting people from other dimensions and universes and some of their own copies, And I loved how Joe Kelly had each of them assume the other was like, oh, I was in charge of the whole thing, fixing everything, and this other guy came for crowd control and cleanup. I was laughing out loud.
It was genuinely funny. Yeah, sort of these dimensional breaches that sort of provides the backdrop for this, because that's what initially has these two characters working together at the beginning. And then, you have Clark's article for the Daily Planet and you have Batman's log of the events. And exactly to your point, they both attribute the crowd control and cleanup to the other one. It's so funny. So in this story, they've already met. They don't yet know each other's identities. This is an instance where Batman has the lead lining in the cowl. That's explicitly said. And Batman essentially says, like, I'll find out who you are. Like, even if I have to comb through all of the college yearbooks.
I've got every college yearbook for the last 20 years. I'll find that chin.
That chin, yeah. So it's a working relationship, but a very tentative one, and they've not yet built that trust between them. And then, yes, they end up on this cruise ship together. Like we said, not for a vacation, but they each have a specific reason while we're there. Lois as well, and Lois has her own room, but Bruce and Clark are once again forced into the situation, but balk at it far more than you saw in that original story. And you really see this
jealousy
kind of, but like the class/culture based tension between them, which later on, and I'll have you do the honors, leads to, hands down for me, the funniest line in this entire thing when Clark, Bruce, and Lois are walking on the deck outside, and Clark makes a crack to Bruce about, like, I can't believe you're even standing up after all that champagne you drank. And Bruce says
something like, hey, Seed, it's not like drinking moonshine out of a pumpkin.
Moonshine out of a pumpkin. Like, it's so, oh man, it was so funny.
There were so many funny phraseology. I mean, like when, one of the things that I thought was laugh out loud funny was part of the context of this story is that, I forget who, somebody hires Deathstroke to assassinate Bruce Wayne.
Well, I think the reveal at the end is Mxyzptlk, who is kind of like pulling the strings for all of this. Right?
Oh, okay.
In this, what they call this is a reimaginary story.
Well said. But there's an assassination attempt or an assassination planned on Bruce Wayne. And at one point, Bruce is kind of turning on the Playboy charm for Lois. And so Deathstroke has a poisoned cocktail, or
I think it's a glass of champagne. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he delivers the poisoned glass to Bruce. But that exact same moment, I think, with his super hearing, he hears Bruce disdain to Lois, like, oh, that hayseed, right? And you see the laser vision, the heat vision, just incinerate the glass. Drink spills on Bruce, and all Clark is just putting his glasses down with anger. Hayseed. There are so many phrases, again, yeah. Hey, it's not like drinking moonshine out of a pumpkin. Even when Lois and Clark and Bruce are all checking in, and Bruce shoves the bag in Clark's chest, going, "Hey, gopher," But when the concierge guy calls Lois a harridan, oh, what a charming little harridan! I thought that was so funny.
I know, it was fun. And what I liked too was Lois being impressed with Clark for not backing down with Bruce. That was a nice beat between them. And again, just the Bruce's reaction in particular to all of this, like this billionaire, this man of infinite means, who also needs this room and this cruise merely for cover and needs the privacy. It's like, of course he would throw a fit at the notion of this. Again, that's one of the funny things too, just going back to that original Silver Age story. It's like, for this millionaire at the time to be forced to share a room, it's like, that would be so offensive.
Such an affront.
Yes, such an affront to the absurdly wealthy. So I'm glad that this was able to tap into that.
And even some of the other things that made me laugh, if I may, they continued that dimensional breach, and they did have Ultraman and Owlman.
Yep, from the Crime Syndicate from Grant Morrison's Earth 2. I mean, obviously we had pre-crisis versions, but in this era, right, they were from Earth 2.
But and there was a degree of confusion, right? I mean, Owlman and Ultraman thought Lois was Power Woman or Superwoman. Yeah. But there was one scene when Ultraman's capturing Lois Lane, or somebody says something like Ixnay on the Erdermay, and that bastardized pig Latin made me laugh. The reference to harridan, even at the one point. Now, what did flabbergast me was the one scene of Clark and Bruce in the bed, and they're both big guys. But why is Clark sleeping in his glasses?
Is it preserving his secret identity?
Okay.
But this leads again to a play on that original moment where we have the dimensional breach outside and they need to change into their other identities. And Bruce's play is to knock Clark out with this sleeping dart or whatever, right? But of course, it bounces right off.
Which he keeps in his black pajamas, black silk pajamas.
But I love that. So when he shoots that at Clark, instantly now Clark knows who he is, and when it bounces off, Bruce has this moment of realization. He goes, "The chin," right? And then they both put it together. Oh, it was I mean, this was. I got to give a shout out to our mutual friend and past guest Mike San Gregorio, because he's a huge Joe Kelly fan, and he had mentioned this issue before, and we did a whole episode on Joe Kelly's run on Action Comics, and I didn't have time to incorporate this one as well. So this had kind of been floating out there, and I knew I'd get to it at some point, and this is the perfect episode for it. But I know now why he always cites that issue. It's genuinely funny in a way that I don't often find comics to be. It was just really a blast. And we haven't even talked about Deadpool.
Very true. Very, very true. Like you said, that one thing with the chin, and they each realize, what I liked about this, and Joe Kelly did a great job, kind of showing the stubbornness that each arrived at. There was such dislike for the other in there, Clark versus Bruce. And like you said, kind of the caste system, here you got this, Clark is probably resentful of the prima donna and the entitlement. And, just this disdain between the two, but they were both so stubborn. I'm not going to back down from this guy.
Here's a question for you. Bruce's treatment of Clark, do you attribute some of that, all of that, none of that to his Playboy persona? Or do you think there's some truth to kind of what's behind those barbs?
In this one, I attribute it to Bruce's Playboy persona. Because this was a comedy, and I knew they were taking liberties, and they were playing up the personalities a bit. So I view this as a one-off. This was a comedy. I mean, I didn't view this as an adventure story or an action or a superhero story. This just made me laugh. So I credit Kelly for playing up that. But like I said, my love of Clark Kent, predominantly from the George Reeves, and my view of Batman, I think this was all a facade. And
then Joe Kelly, of course, who had written Deadpool, uses Deadpool in all but name in this. And of course, makes sense, right? Because of Deathstroke, right? Slade Wilson, Wade Wilson, right? The looks are very similar.
Exactly.
And every time he's about to tell his name, right, he gets interrupted in some way. And Deathstroke even has a comment at some point about man, we're almost like identical people.
Yeah, I thought that was well done.
Yeah, that was funny. I mean, to use another company's character, like we've seen plenty of instances where there are analogs where clearly these are based on another company's characters. But this was, I mean, he was just writing Deadpool. He just couldn't say that it was Deadpool. So it was pretty funny.
Right.
And then, they battle with the crime syndicate. And then at the end, not unlike that original story, now you have this business of Lois being highly suspicious, right? Of Clark and Bruce actually being Batman and Superman. And this leads to a very funny bit where Superman throws his voice using his super ventriloquism, and Lois turns, and then Superman at super speed changes his clothes and changes
and screws
Batman.
over. Yeah, screws over Batman.
Yeah, change at super speed, changes Bruce out of his costume. And then they're stumbling back as Clark and Bruce. And that seems to put her suspicions to rest. But I just love where he's like, "You undressed me at super speed." He's throwing up over the side of the, that was so funny.
Yes.
Yeah.
And wasn't there an earlier scene when, I know Clark tried to say, "Hey, Lois, maybe I could share your cabin with you." And she goes, "Were you working all day to work up to ask that?" And he goes, "Yes, But then a few seconds later, after that one line with, "Hey, you had a lot of champagne and the moonshine," they say goodnight to Lois, and under his breath, Bruce goes, "I'll give you $1 million if you jump overboard right now."
Yeah, it was legit funny. It was a very, very entertaining reimagining of of Superman number 76. So if anyone hasn't read it, it's really good for a laugh. I was very pleasantly surprised by that. The next one from 2011, I know from your expression earlier, I don't think you had a chance to read this one. This is Superman number 710.
No.
This was during the grounded arc where Superman is walking the earth. Though at this point, J. Michael Straczynski has really departed the title, though he remains credited as co-writer. But as we've come to learn, he essentially had left behind an extremely loose outline for his successor, Chris Roberson. So I think this was mostly that second writer story. But what was interesting about this one is that you have Superman and Batman meet up on this trek, and this is right after Batman had been seemingly killed in Final Crisis, and then had his journey through time back to the present. And this is one of their first, if not their first, encounters since that point. And then they start reminiscing about this time in their past when they were both traveling the world, and they intersected in Butran, and there was all of this business about Vandal Savage mounting an attack to try to discover the secret location of Nanda Parbat from the people in Butran.
That's an interesting premise.
And it tied into a Prestige format one shot by Chuck Dixon and Graham Nolan from 99 called Superman the Odyssey. That's all about Clark traveling the earth. And there's like a panel in that story where Clark and Bruce are sort of walking past each other. And so this kind of takes us back to that and plays in that timeline in that world. And essentially they work together to protect this settlement, this village, or the country essentially from Vandal's attack. And what's interesting is that Batman or Bruce, right? He's not yet Batman, but he, over the course of this battle, through the narration, we learn he comes to now understand and appreciate the value of working with a partner, of working together. So that's planting the seed for what he'll become later. Clark, meanwhile, talks about how he had been helping people along the way, but always in secret as he traveled the world. But during this battle, he was really essentially operating in full view of everyone, and just kind of that feeling of standing out there in front of everyone and doing his thing and not hiding it, what that felt like to him. So they both have these takeaways and these realizations through this battle that they fight side by side in their past there. So again, I think what was interesting to me was how it tied into that one shot that I remember well from reading it as a kid. And I once again have a copy. Shout out to Bernie Gersmeyer who sent it to me. So I once again have a copy of that. So it tied into that. And again, just this notion of them crossing paths during their journey. And like I said before we get into the flashback, in their conversation, reference is made to the cruise ship, to Magpie. So sort of this attempt to try to manage all of these past meetings and try to fit them all into some sort of cohesive piece.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, after that, we head into the New 52 era and the Batman Superman title by Greg Pak and Jay Lee. Now, the first arc is it called Crossworld?
Yes.
I did not read the entire thing, I will confess, but I like the beginning part where Clark and Bruce meet. Bruce is undercover, kind of in his.
Oh, it's very reminiscent of Batman Year One by.
Yes. And there's all this business about a kid who's being bullied, and Clark and Bruce each have different ideas about how that situation should be dealt with. And then as the story goes on, and I at least flipped through the whole thing, I know that we deal with the Earth 2 versions of these characters, and kind of as the starting point, there's that scene in Smallville.
Yes, I loved, and I will say, oh boy, I got a lot to say on this one. Jay Lee's artwork, his artwork is so distinctive, but I don't know if it was the right artist for this story. I mean, what a difference versus World's Finest 84 or World's Finest 94. The brightness of those things and the darkness here. I forget whether it was issue 2 or issue 3. They did tie right into the Jeff Loeb, Tim Sale, and I loved it. And for the benefit of the listeners, in the Loeb Sale one, it was only 2 pages. Pete Ross and Clark see Bruce at a distance, and there's no interaction. Here, something happens, and I think Jonathan invites Alfred and Bruce to come have dinner or spend some time. So the boys get to know one another, but it does show their difference in personalities. I loved, and this is the Earth 2 meeting, I'm sorry, the New 52 Earth 2, not the Silver Age Earth 2. But I loved this as a character study. I mean, quite frankly, and I know I'm jumping ahead, I didn't care that much for the villain, the trickster. I don't think the story added that much, but we got 2 first meetings in this story. But I did love the juxtaposition of the very young Prime Earth Bruce and Clark, who were really didn't care for one another and apprehensive and suspicious of one another and had their different styles, juxtaposed against this Earth 2 where they're best friends. Older versions, more powerful, more experienced. I thought, again, we got 2 first meetings for the price of 1. I loved the throwback to that 2-pager Smallville. I really enjoyed that. But overall, the story, I didn't think the story itself was that good, absent these meetings.
No, fair enough. Again, from what I read, though, I liked kind of going back to that moment and seeing how things would have played out differently, or could have played out differently if there had been that interaction, that reaching out, right? And there, I think at some point, Jonathan says something to Alfred to the effect of maybe Alfred's talking about Bruce being lonely, and Jonathan has some line about, like, I also have a lonely child, and now he has someone he can connect with, something to that effect, which I thought was a nice moment. So I really do like the art. It is different. It's a very specific style and probably not what you would typically expect to see in that kind of title, but I liked it. That's a run that, while I haven't read it, it's something that I'll probably get to at some point. I was intrigued enough.
For this discussion, I ordered it through Amazon, and I got the entire thing. I read all 4. I enjoyed it. I think Michelle Janin did that one story where he expanded on the Kents hosting dinner for Alfred and Bruce. And it really showed them meeting as boys. It evolved the Loeb Sale thing. But they were best friends as in that older rendition. They were best buds. Whereas there was a lot of animosity between the Dave Mazzucchelli Year 1 and Clark. No, I think it was more a character study than anything else.
Right on. So a few years after that, of course, we would have Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, the first big screen meeting between Superman and Batman. Now, again, we just did a whole episode on this.
I'm sorry. The other thing I wanted to say that this was reminiscent of the crazy Silver Age things, because at the end of this thing, they wiped everybody's minds. So, yeah, what did we really learn? None of them really remember it, which I thought was kind of a little bit of I would be okay with the older Earth 2 versions remembering it, but it was just totally washed out for Prime Earth.
Gotcha.
Sorry, I wanted to
totally fine. So BVS, we just did an entire episode on it. So I'll just kind of open it. Is there anything you want to say about Superman and Batman's meeting in that movie?
My best memories of that movie are, and I think we've touched on this, I'll try to keep it crisp. I thought it was fantastic to show Bruce witnessing the destruction at the very beginning, because I think that really drove home his animosity and his ferocity to, I got to stop this guy. He could destroy the world. So I thought him watching the destruction in the sky was fantastic. As I've told you before, on your recommendation, I got the extended cut and watched it. I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I thought it showed their personalities, and it showed their personalities changing where they became partners. I land on the side of, I do not like all the ridicule that statement that Martha receives. Yeah, sure. I thought, and I credit you, you gave me the words, but I had the same perception. It jarred Batman away from killing him. So I think anything else would not have jarred him away. Sure.
I think I was thinking, is there anything else that I have to say that we didn't already talk about? The only thing, I was just thinking about the movie again in the context of all of these other meetings. And I guess what is interesting or distinct about this one is that you have Batman going after Superman in a way that you really don't see in any of these other stories. If anything, it's Superman who's going out to bring Batman in, or they come into conflict, and there's a difference in
That's a
method,
good point.
as
That's a
opposed
good
to
point.
here where Batman is full on hunting Superman
That's
at the
a
beginning
great
of this. So it definitely leans into the tension in a far more potent way than you typically see. But even in that movie, and as polarizing as it is, they do come to a place of understanding and teamwork by the end of it. And you get to Zack Snyder's Justice League, and there's thankfully at least that one aftermath scene when they're back on the farm and Bruce has bought the bank, and that's how he gets the farm back. And they've got this nice little moment together. Obviously would have loved to have seen more of those kinds of moments where now you see what it's like between them now that they've come out the other side of it. But again, just the fact that it's Batman hunting Superman, I think puts a different spin on it than what we've seen elsewhere. All right. We'll see if we can keep this under 2.5 hours, but to bring us home here, we have World's Finest number 18 and 19, just from last year, 2023, during the dawn of DC. So we're out of the New 52 era. We're in this dawn of DC publishing initiative. Mark Waid wrote it, of course. Travis G. Moore is the artist. And you have, I was not reading this as it came out. I've kind of been letting them pile up. And then I read these two specifically for this. And I had so much fun with it. Like I said, I think it's a really great synthesis of a lot of these different dynamics and even specific story beats where you have the Riddler committing crimes in Gotham, and we open on a cruise ship, right? And there's these messages written in Kryptonese. So of course that catches Superman's attention, brings him to Gotham. And ultimately what we find out is that Jack Sawyer from the Phantom Zone has been able to take advantage of these breaches that are opening, that are swallowing up Gotham residents. And he's able to use his mind force to contact Riddler.
Telepathic prowess.
Right. And sort of manipulate Superman and Batman into position. The initial aim is to try to take Superman's place, send Superman to the Phantom Zone. He ends up grabbing Batman. And we kind of go from there. But yeah, what stood out to you, especially as someone you've been reading these stories your whole life? Like what stood out to you?
There was an immense amount I liked about this. Oh God. I commend Mark Waid for bundling together all these Silver Age concepts and tropes. I thought the story was well constructed. I was more appreciative of these two guys as villains than.
And did you? I don't know how much you watched Superman the animated series, but this version of Jack Sawyer, straight from the animated series.
Exactly. Yes, I did. I was conscious of that.
And not to take us too far afield, but I just, taking the long view of the character, when they did those Superman the animated series episodes, like clearly that was meant to be Zod and Feora or Zod and Ursa, but they couldn't use those characters. So it became, did they actually call him Jack Sawyer and Mala? I think were the two names that were given to them. So they at least used the name that we were familiar with. But it was like clearly meant to be Zod, but they couldn't go there.
Yes.
But it's like now I feel like I don't know how to put this. It's not that this World's Finest story adds legitimacy to that, but it's like now it kind of ties something together where now there's like a look to this character.
Yeah. In these two issues, 18 and 19, Jack Sawyer's physical appearance is identical to Superman, especially with the Cyclops eye or the cybernetic eye. I loved this because there were so many Easter eggs that I thought Waid pulled together. And as a child, I can remember certain Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen or Action Comics where they'd be, there's a breach in the Phantom Zone and this guy got out here. So this tied back to stories from the early 60s when, a meteorite or an asteroid would hit there'd be an explosion, there'd be a breach. I liked that. I thought the way they were making the Riddler go crazy and then he was giving clues in Kryptonese was fantastic. I thought it was a very decent mystery. One thing I really liked was it showed the intelligence of both characters. And there was two incidents that really, to me, honed in on their intelligence. I thought the way Bruce invited Clark to his mansion, and then goes, hey, give me, I need a few minutes. I'm wrapping up a business call or something. And then he comes back half an hour later and he goes, so Superman. And Clark gets all indignant. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm out of here. Well, before you go out, you ought to pay attention to a man who wears nose filters, because for the last half hour, I flooded this room with knockout gas, and you look pretty hale and hearty. So I thought, wow, that's quintessential Bruce controlling the environment, and it speaks to Bruce's intelligence. But what I also liked was they were not at each other's throats on this thing. They were pretty cooperative from page one. And immediately after proving Clark and Superman are one and the same, Bruce invites Superman down to the Batcave, and
Well, he's like, "Well, I have a secret too," and Clark's like, "Oh, I know." The way Bruce has put the pieces together by charting Superman's flight paths and pinpointing this connection between the building that Clark lives
And
at
his
and the Daily
planet,
being able to narrow it down. But then, yes, the reveal with the gas to really say, "Nope, I got you," was very clever. So I enjoyed this a lot. I think what's up?
There are just two other.
Okay, go for it. It's okay.
No, because this might influence some of your perception or conclusion. I thought there was a great throwback. I mean, as you said earlier, hey, we had one page of Magpie, which tied into Man of Steel. We clearly had the Bottle City of Kandor, right? But also, I loved the throwback to the Richard Donner, the second Superman movie, where they used the fortress and that was a credit to Superman's intellect, his intellect. He re-engineered or told Batman to re-engineer the Phantom Zone projector to make the fortress the way to get Jax-Ur back in the Phantom Zone. That reminded me so much of that second Superman movie.
Yeah, that was a nice, clever touch, and definitely called that movie to mind. I think what stood out the most, what I probably enjoyed the most, was when Batman's stuck in the Phantom Zone. And by the way, there's this mystery cloaked figure who seems to be responsible for the breaches, who's going to play into future storylines, which we'll get to. But when Bruce is stuck in the Phantom Zone and Superman's explaining the backstory with Jax-Ur, that he was engaged in this space travel and his spacecraft crashed into one of Krypton's populated moons and killed tens of thousands. And not only that, but after that, Krypton really ceased its space exploration, right? Really cracked down. And that's why when the time came to try to evacuate the planet, they couldn't. They didn't have the means to. So to Superman, there's an element of blame towards Jax-Ur for creating the conditions that led to everyone dying. And you see how Batman is kind of taking all of that in. And this was clearly a part of his backstory that he didn't know. And clearly there's this connection point given what Bruce himself has lost. So I think it allows Bruce certainly to see Superman in a different way, which I really liked. I guess the thing that this wasn't my favorite aspect of it. I don't need them to be at each other's throats, but I guess I do like a little bit more initial friction between the two of them that then you see them work through. To your point here, Superman shows up in Gotham. He talks to Gordon. He realizes Batman is out eavesdropping. He makes a point about respecting Batman's privacy and not peeking beneath the cowl. I don't know what we can attribute this to. I mean, maybe because, look, the title is World's Finest, and clearly Waid has a lot of love for the Silver Age iteration. Maybe part of it is that, where they're just starting off on more common ground and better footing. Maybe, though we don't see it, maybe Superman or Clark has researched more about Batman and has seen the positive effects he's brought about in the city. Maybe this business about methods just isn't as relevant here. I don't know. But yeah, the only real tension really seems to be Batman works alone. Like that's kind of the main thing. And by the end of it, he's a little bit more open to maybe having a partner, maybe working with someone. But it's not about, how we go about things per se. It's really more just I work alone, and Superman's kind of encroaching on that.
Boy, great summary. And you triggered a couple of thoughts in my mind. Yeah, I wish there were a little bit more friction at the beginning. I've come to appreciate that because their natures are so different. This was too quick. Like, hey, I know your identity, you know mine. Let's team up. I wish there were a little bit more friction. What I'm wondering is the thing you raised maybe a couple of hours ago. In Waid's universe, is this when they learn one another's identities, or is this their first meeting? Or is he going to tell a story where, hey, they meet as heroes?
No, I think this is meant to be their first meeting.
Okay.
I'm almost certain. I think that was or at least that's how this was billed.
Okay. Oh, yes, the title. Yeah.
By the way, I love the interior art by Travis Moore is great, but those covers, especially the cover to part 1, I posted it on social media a bunch of times, but the two of them with the split, it's
that is so cool.
The Dan Moore cover, absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah. How many of these issues have we read that had the same title?
Oh, I don't know.
You know, the origin of the Superman-Batman team. I mean, probably at least 3 of them of these. What I did see, and I know we're kind of winding down, kind of the way different stories connect with prior stories. Like you said, that Joe Kelly write-up, syncing up with 76. A number of elements in this Waid one, like with Magpie and other things, syncing up with the Byrne story. And even the Loeb Sale tie-in between Crossworld and that Secret Origins thing. So I do like the fact that they're kind of modernizing or enhancing an earlier element. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. These were, honestly, I had such a great time going through all of these. So, thank you for your interest in doing this and taking the time to go through all of these stories and have this discussion. And audience, I've already heard from a bunch of you about your favorite first meeting, but, please reach out. I'd be really curious. And if any of the stories that we talked about, if they were unfamiliar to you and now you go and check them out, I'd be very curious to hear what you think about them. So please do feel free to reach out. But Rich, thank you again for coming here and doing this.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed this assignment, this action, this effort. I enjoyed it. And I got more out of it than I thought I would. I thought some of this I would read and just make a note and move on. This was very, very enjoyable. And a credit to all the creators, for trying to keep it fresh.
Yeah, it's such a core dynamic and relationship. And you see it spun in a lot of different ways over time, over media. And to just be able to kind of sit in it for a while and go through each of them was really fascinating, and certainly won't be the last time we talk about this world's finest duo. So thank you, Rich. Thank you, audience. As always, I always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next week for another all-new episode. And until then, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.